Welcome to Sikh Cast, brought to you by Sikh Research Institute, illuminating every path.
In this episode of the Sikh Cast, join researchers Santbir Singh and Damanpreet Singh as they reflect on Vaisakhi and the principles of sovereignty. The two discuss Santbir Singh's article titled Sovereignty in Motion, Sikh Governance Models. Listen in as they explore sovereignty as it manifests in four political forms across the 18th and early 19th centuries.
Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Thank you for joining us today on the Sikh Cast. Today we're joined by Santbir Singh, who's a research associate at the Sikh Research Institute and is pursuing his PhD in sociology at York University. My name is Damanpreet Singh, and I'll be speaking to Santbir today about his article Sovereignty in Motion, Sikh Governance Models, which assesses how Sikh sovereignty was practiced between the period of Banda Singh Bahadur through the period of the Sarkar-e-Khalsa before Punjab's annexation by the British in 1849. Welcome, Santbir. Thanks for talking to me today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Vaiguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaiguru Ji Ki Fateh. It's wonderful being here, Damanpreet. I really appreciate getting the opportunity to talk about this article, especially during this time of year where we think a lot about sovereignty and what it means to the Khalsa. Around Vaisakhi time, this is an important time to think about these issues. And I thought that it would be interesting to sort of look back at how Sikhs practice that sovereignty in previous historical time periods.
Yeah, your article gave me personally a lot to think about. And I'm excited to get into some of the arguments that you make and some of the things that you point out that I hadn't quite thought about before. So the key term, as I see it in your piece, is of course sovereignty. And I think sovereignty is widely understood to mean the ability to govern or administer a state. But as we know from even maybe a cursory understanding of Sikh history, Sikhs have not always, and more often than not, haven't possessed an independent state. Yet you're saying here that Sikh sovereignty has been a continual practice, both in the presence and absence of a state. I wonder if you can say more about how you're understanding sovereignty, given the kind of non-necessity of a state, and if you can describe what sovereignty means, both in Sikh thought and in Sikh history. Yeah, maybe we'll start there.
Yeah, that sounds great. Western sovereignty historically was often defined as a territorial exclusivity, being a single supreme authority over an area, a land, and then essentially being able to govern that area to the exclusive right of any other force or any other being or any other power. And historically, that sovereignty was concentrated within a single individual who was the monarch. And of course, that changed in the modern era, or in more contemporary times, I should say, where now sovereignty in Western democratic theory resides in the people, but it is expressed through representation, rights, and like constitutional law. And what I'm trying to say in the article is that Sikh sovereignty is something quite different than that. First of all, Sikh sovereignty doesn't begin with when we had a state. It begins with Guru Nanak Sahib Ji. And in that understanding, and we take this from Guru Granth Sahib Ji, especially from Ram Kali Ki War by Satta and by Balwand, this idea that Guru Nanak started Nanak Raj Chalaya Sach Kot Satani Neev De, that Guru Nanak started this Raj or this sovereign rule. Now, if we look at the life of Guru Nanak, it doesn't seem very much like he started sovereign rule. He, a lot of the aspects of the Guruship that seem more politically forward or politically sovereign sort of came afterwards. The idea of calling the Guru Satya Patsha, for example, started probably during Guru Ram Das's time. The Miri Piri idea was most firmly articulated by Guru Har Gobind Sahib Ji, and it was from Guru Har Gobind Sahib Ji onwards that the Gurus sort of styled themselves more as political sovereigns in the more traditional sense. But according to Gurbani, we consider Guru Nanak to be sovereign. And I think what it means in the Sikh sense is that sovereignty is something that is received from the divine, and that it cannot be taken away by any other being or any other state or any other force. It's something that's innate within the Guru. And the Guru's power of sovereignty means that regardless of how the Guru is living at the time, they are a sovereign entity. And that sovereignty that the Guru had within them was then passed on to the Guru Khalsa Panth by Guru Gobind Singh Ji. And so in the post Guru Gobind Singh Ji period, after Guru Gobind Singh Ji's passing away, his Jyoti Jyot, we see that Sikhs practices sovereignty in different ways according to the different constraints of the time, according to the different historical sort of situations that arose at the time, according to the different um, uh, political considerations of the time. But sovereignty from a Sikh angle is something that is received from the divine and can only be practiced or can only be articulated through an ethical lens as it appears under Gurmat. So that's a really important part of sovereignty in the Sikh aspect, is that it is something that is practiced under the purview of Gurmat. And Gurmat, of course, the thinking of the Guru. And it's what we all are trying to aspire to. And as a community, it's what we try to aspire to as well. And it means that Sikh sovereignty is only legitimate when it is being practiced under that ideal of Gurmat. When it removes itself from Gurmat, then it is not legitimate anymore. And I think that's what really makes it quite different from Western ideas of sovereignty, which don't have that idea of the divine being integral to the process, and don't also have, historically, they did to some degree, like the king uh, was thought of as divinely chosen, for example. So there was some commonality there. That is less so today, the idea of the divine right of kings. We don't really practice that in modern Western democracies anymore. But this idea that divinity is really important, and it also means something quite remarkable in the Sikh imagination. It's this idea that every individual is sovereign. So that sovereignty is not something that is just contained within the monarch, just contained within the elite. It's contained within each individual member of the Khalsa Panth. That everyone who is a member of the Khalsa Panth is within themselves a sovereign entity. And we can see this being sort of really beautifully thought of and talked about in Sikh history when we talk about ideas like each Sikh is Savalak. And so that's in a military sense, that means we're Savalak, that we can take on a lot of enemies on the battlefield. But it also means that we contain multitudes, that we are, in fact, within ourselves almost a population, and we should be treated as such, that each individual Sikh is something unique and has that sovereignty within themselves. And we can only have the sovereignty within ourselves while we have a relationship with the Guru. So that relationship with the Guru is really important in Sikh ideas of sovereignty. I hope that helps clarify a little bit.
It does, and that also leads me to ask a few, maybe two follow-up questions to you. I think the first question that I am curious to ask you is, you talked about the relationship between some kind of divine authority and how sovereignty is legitimated in divinity in Sikh
Yes.
thought, which, as you said, isn't really how sovereignty is legitimated in the Western democracies that we might be most familiar with, our listeners might be most familiar with. But there is some kind of precedent in the Western worlds of the divine right of kings, as you mentioned. But I'm curious what that seeking legitimacy in divinity looks like in the Sikh context, because I think it's quite different from even what the divine right of kings in the Western context suggested about the kind of authority a king has as being uniquely sanctioned by God. That's not quite what you're describing in the Sikh context, and I think it's also different from maybe other correlates we have in the contemporary context of kind of a theocracy, right?
Yes, definitely.
So I'm curious if you could say more about that. The term that you use in your article is political theology to describe kind of the rootedness of Sikh political thought in central Sikh texts and also the kind of foundational Sikh history from the embodied Guru period. So I think it would be helpful to me and maybe to our listeners if you could say more about kind of what's distinct about the Sikh political theology.
Yes, for sure. I think I'd like to take a quick moment, though, to just really narrow down on that idea of what makes our idea of divinity so radically different. Because you're right, the European monarchs had that idea of divine right of kings, but for them, God or the divine was something very removed from this world, something that was separate from this world, something that was transcendent. Whereas in the in Sikh understanding, Vaheguru or Ik Oankar is both transcendent and immanent, in that it is also within us. It exists within us and it exists within creation, and it is not separate from us in any way. And so it is that spark of the divine within each individual that actually gives us that sovereignty. So the sovereignty is not something that's sort of granted to us. It's something that's innate within us because of the nature of our being. The fact that we are all aspects of Ikon God in a sense. And when I talk about Sikh political theology, what I'm talking about is the Sikh tradition, the tradition's way of understanding and thinking about power. So it's like, let me see how I can articulate this. It's a framework through which Sikhi links Miri and Piri, which is that idea of sovereignty over all realms, both temporal and spiritual. And it's something that understands sovereignty as a sacred trust carried by the House of Nanak, by Guru Nanak Sahib Ji, and evaluates governance by whether it aligns with Gurmat. And that means that it has certain ethical considerations, such as protecting the vulnerable, caring for those who aren't able to care for themselves, protecting the rights of all individuals, ensuring that society respects a multiplicity of different opinions and views. All those different ideas that we see historically that Sikhs practiced in terms of how the areas that we governed existed. And so for me, Sikh political theology is something about how our political authority is answerable to Guru Granth Sahib Ji and also to the collective responsibility of the Guru Khalsa Panth. And so this makes it quite different than, for example, other types of political theories. And it makes it very different from other types of theological governance models as well. So, for example, one that's in the news very much today is Iran. And in Iran is the theocracy. But we can see that in Iran, the theocratic nature of the Iranian state is very different than what a Sikh theocracy would be, because the Sikh theocracy, of course, would be something that would be accountable to the people because it would be made of the people themselves as a Guru Khalsa Panth. And it would be something that was responsible to the collective. Whereas the theocracy in Iran is something that's dominated by an elite, by a spiritual elite that have power and authority over the rest of the population. And that's something that's very different than the way Sikhs would understand a theocracy, for example. And that's why we try to avoid using these terms as much as possible, because Sikhi so reimagines them and understands them in such a radically different way. And this is why a lot of Sikhs today, avoid using the term God, for example, as well, because it has so many connotations with it, and it brings to mind so many different ideas that run counter to Gurmat. And so, in the same way, I say political theology. I'm not totally comfortable with that term theology because it makes Sikhi sound like um, this really rigid set of rules, which it's not. Um, and what I'm trying to say is that it's that interplay between midi and bidi, uh, practiced by the Panth under the authority of Guru Granth Sahib Ji. And that idea of Guru Granth Sahib Ji having authority over us is also a radically unique idea in the Sikh compared to other traditions, that the scripture itself is the authoritative voice for Sikhs, and is a living being in a sense, not in a physical sense, but as a Shabad Guru. I hope that helps explain a little bit.
Yeah, yeah, that is a very helpful explanation. And it sounds like what you're saying is that um, there's kind of ethical, there's an ethical framework of Gurmat, let's say. Maybe perhaps instead of theological, we can say for the time being. And there are kind of institutional ways in which sovereignty was enacted throughout the period that is under assessment in your article, from Banda Singh Bahadur to Ranjit Singh, that in different ways tried to um, make that ethical framework, translate that ethical framework into governance. And it seems like you're saying in the article, and I'd be curious to maybe get into some of the specific historical periods that you talk, the specific historical moments, let's say, that you talk about here. It seems that you say in the article that given the historical moment that we're up against, the way in which kind of Gurmat translates into kind of the institutions of sovereignty looks different because the circumstances are different. And at different points, the Sikhs kind of have to be flexible in the way in which they enact their sovereignty, given the kind of constraints of history. And given that kind of framework you set up for us, I wonder if now is a good time to kind of walk through each of the four moments that you discuss in the article.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So what I've done here is that I've looked at the pre-colonial era, so everything before 1849, and post Guru Gobind Singh Ji, so post 1708. And looking at it from a political lens, I have divided up, and we could divide it up in a lot of different ways, to be honest. And another writer or another researcher may divide it up very differently than I divided it up. But I divided it up into four distinct periods. The first is that era of Baba Banda Singh Bahadur. So we're looking at right after Guru Gobind Singh Ji from 1708 until Banda Singh Bahadur Shahidi in 1716. But really more like 1714, 1715, because after that they were under siege and were not really able to practice political sovereignty in a meaningful way, because they were being so suppressed by the Mughal government at the time. The second period is the period after Baba Banda Singh Bahadur, up until the early 1760s, and I give the exact date of 1765. And we'll talk about why that date in particular. And this is a time period where essentially from about 1722 up to 1765, Sikhs were engaged in continuous warfare against the Mughal state and against Afghan invaders, led by Ahmad Shah Durrani, the Emperor of Afghanistan. And so this was really a very difficult period of our history. Um, but I also point out that though it was a difficult part of our history, it's also a part of our history that's in a lot of ways the most inspiring. And we have a lot of examples from that time period that we still look to of how Sikhi should be practiced under duress or under um, in difficult circumstances. You know, people like Baitadu Singh, people like Baitara Singh Van, people like Bhai Mehtab Singh and Vaisakhi Singh, people like Baba Bota Singh and Baba Garja Singh. All of these examples, Bibi Bigel Kaur, for example, all of these examples of really amazing Gursikhs during this period who suffered a lot and were often martyred, were shaheed, but were able to still practice that idea of sovereignty in a really real way, um, but not in a way that may be um, easily understood by an outsider because they didn't have territory at that time. We didn't control land at that time. We didn't have a real system of governance at that time. But I still think of it as a time when Sikhs were sovereign, very much so, and practice that sovereignty. Come back to each period, but let's first introduce each period. The third period, sorry, I call the Khalsa Sultanate. And I call it the Khalsa Sultanate because by Jassa Singh Ahluwalia, who was the leader of the Dal Khalsa, was given the title of Sultan al Qom by the Khalsa Panth when the Panth freed Lahore for the first time in 1761. And in 1765, the Sikhs formally took over Punjab from the Mughals and Afghanis, and the Mughals and Afghanis were never able to rule Punjab again after that time period. And Abdali was never able to invade again after that time period either. And so I call it the Khalsa Sultanate or the Sikh Sultanate, but it's not a sultanate in the way that it's understood in Muslim societies or Muslim theocracy. It's something very different, and it's essentially what we would call the missile confederacies, so that there were multiple missiles and they worked together at times. At other times, they did not work together. They came together to deal with outside invaders together or outside issues that needed to be dealt with, and they governed through the Sarbat Khalsa model. And then the fourth period would be the one that's probably most well known by modern Sikhs, which is Ranjit Singh's Raj, which officially had the term Sarkari Khalsa, which was this essentially a royal court from 1799 right up to 1849, but really meaningfully stopped during the first Anglo-Sikh Wars, and after that sort of became a puppet state of the British after that time.
Mm-hmm. So,
Um,
yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say it might be useful here to maybe pause and um, think about, describe kind of each of these moments in, as you've already started to do. So it seems like um, starting from the Banda Singh Bahadur period, which you call a period of kind of moral reversal, and then there's this period of insurgency, and then the period of the Sultanate or the Confederacy, and then the kind of administrative state of the monarchy.
Yes.
And each of these we can narrate as, I think, teaching us what you're saying is that they all kind of teach us something different about how Sikh sovereignty can be put into practice. So maybe starting from the beginning with Banda Singh Bahadur, would you want to just describe kind of the lessons that you are hoping to emphasize for listeners and readers today about kind
Yeah,
of
for
how Banda Singh Bahadur's kind of practice of sovereignty, that period's practice of sovereignty, can kind of inform us or
yeah.
understand. You call it a repertoire at different points, but how that can help us understand kind of a particular aspect of the practice of Sikh sovereignty, let's say.
Yeah, I had a hard time thinking of a phrase that would sum up this idea that in each of these eras, we practiced sovereignty, but it looked radically different. And the reason why it looked radically different is not because the Gurmat changed, it's because the situation changed. And Sikhs used to be quite flexible historically, to be able to really think on their feet and be able to change according to the constraints of the time. And they were able to practice this political sovereignty in very different ways in these different eras based on the pressures that they were facing. Under Baba Banda Singh Bahadur, we lack a lot of information about how that Khalsa Raj, how that Sikh state actually operated. We don't have a lot of information about, how it was administered, what the relationship was between villages or parganas, as they were called, or districts as we know them today, and the Khalsa Raj at the top, what the relationship was between those different levels of government and stuff. So it's difficult to understand it, but there's still a lot that we can learn from that time period. And one of the most important things that we can learn from that time period is that Baba Banda Singh Bahadur was primarily focused on the people who were most oppressed, and freeing them from the from the shackles that they were kept in for centuries at that time. And so we see this most radically in Baba Banda Singh Bahadur's destruction, or the Khalsa army's destruction, of the zamindari system, which was this system where large landowners controlled the land, and the people who worked the land were essentially serfs and did had no ownership over the land itself. And Baba Banda Singh Bahadur came in and enacted radical land reform in a way that might make a lot of contemporary Sikhs very uncomfortable, to be quite honest. He didn't really care about land rights or the rights of the of the people to own the land that they had, and instead took away that land from the people and gave it from the elites and gave it to the people directly, which was really something revolutionary. There was also some other really important things that were happening during Baba Banda Singh Bahadur's time that we can see as a through line through all the different eras. And one of those is this idea of uh, how political sovereignty was articulated and understood by the Khalsa, and how it was represented to the people who were being ruled by the Khalsa. And so one of the most obvious and physical demonstrations of this is coins. And so during this time period, coins, right up through to Ranjit Singh's time period, coins were never issued in the name of the ruler or the people, but issued in the name of the Guru instead, always. It was Guru Nanak, Guru Gobind Singh, or the 10 Gurus essentially, that the coins were minted under their authority. And so that's that idea of Gurmat being the highest um, sort of authority in the land at that time. And with that comes a lot of really important responsibilities for the Khalsa at that time. What does it mean to rule in the name of the Guru? Well, it means that you have to enact certain principles and practices that uphold the values that the Gurus articulated during the time of the embodied Gurus, and that are still articulated in Guru Granth Sahib Ji. That means respecting people's rights, caring for those who can't care for themselves, creating a more equitable and uh, egalitarian system. We see a lot of this, both of us, you primarily, but I also teach a couple of classes of Sikhi 201 at Sikh Research Institute's annual leadership retreat, SIDDIC. And we talk a lot about just these things, uh, caravan of revolutions, this idea of what is the point of the Khalsa, and he gives three main ideas of what the point of the Khalsa is, and one of them is to capture power for the common people. The second is to get rid of elites, and the third is to create an egalitarian society. And Baba Banda Singh Bahadur, in a very short amount of time, was able to do all three in a really tiny amount of time. We're talking about like a few months after Guru Gobind Singh Ji's Jyoti Jot, they were able to do this quite quickly and take over a huge swath of land. Really impressive. They weren't able to hold it, unfortunately, because the Mughal Empire was so much stronger, so much more powerful. And at the time when they had taken over Punjab, the Mughals were really preoccupied with South India. But once they realized what was happening in Punjab on the doorsteps of Delhi, they turned their attention back to Punjab and really came down like a hammer on the Sikhs. In that, so Baba Banda Singh Bahadur's period is this really beautiful time period that is still an inspiration for Sikhs today and served as an inspiration for generations of Sikhs throughout the 18th and 19th centuries as well. That Sikhs, it showed that Sikhs were able to govern, that this was not something theoretical. It showed that we actually were able to mint coins, have an administrative system, even though if we don't know the details of how the administration actually functioned, that Sikhs were able to create a governance model that actually worked and that people respected and people bought into, and something that the common folks um, really passionately became a part of. And that's where the population of the Khalsa grew really dramatically as well, because in every village that the Khalsa entered, they would, destroy the elites and give power to the common people. And people were inspired to become Sikhs because of that. And the population of the Khalsa grew really dramatically during this time period. So, really, an incredible time period that really has a lot of significance for the rest of Sikh history.
Yeah, I do really like the phrase that you use in the piece of moral reversal, this kind of idea that really quickly kind of there's a willingness to kind of upend kind of how society is structured in um the name of the House of Nanak, in the name of kind of giving power and I mean materially land to the common people. There's this kind of as you're saying, this kind of rapid willingness to kind of take radical action in this
Yes.
period, which is a short period, as you're saying. It leads to a period of what you call insurgency. You also call this survival with an argument, the 1716 to 65 piece, governance in motion. These are kind of different phrases that I picked up on in that section. Um, could you describe kind of how we move from this period of like really rapid transformation, this kind of really inspirational period, to a period of kind of survival?
So the brutal suppression of the Sikhs that signaled the end of the rule of the Khalsa at the time, and it wasn't the rule of Baba Banda Singh Bahadur, it was the rule of the Khalsa. He's just the most prominent person of the time and the leader on the battlefield, so we of course use his name a lot, but he wasn't a king in any sense of the word or a monarch, right? And that idea of survival with an argument, it really was survival. Like it was desperate survival that we were doing. But it wasn't just survival for survival's sake. And why I say survival with an argument, it's because Sikhs were making a point that they were still articulating very clearly how they wanted society to function, even in the midst of desperately trying to survive, some really horrific uh, and genocidal campaigns against them in this time period. The Shota Kalukara, the Vada Kalukara, price being put on Sikhs' heads, Sikh women being imprisoned and their children being butchered, all these horrific things that happened during this time period. So this is a time period where Sikhs were, for a lot, for decades of this time period, Sikhs weren't even living in Punjab in a really stable way. They oftentimes were hiding in the jungles. Punjab used to have jungles before colonialism. Punjab also had was surrounded by the mountains to the east and the north, and desert to the south, and so the Khalsa would often go to the mountains or the deserts of Rajasthan, and sort of camp out there while suppression was at its height. And so this is a time of a lot of movement, in a very physical sense, movement, but also a time of movement in the sense of how the Sikhs organized themselves. So they changed quite dramatically. They went from jathas to like having 25 jathas to having 100 jathas to having 11 missals. And they sort of changed the way that they were structured very much according to the constraints of the time and according to what their capacity was at the time. So they were very flexible in a really impressive way. Um, and they were able to do all of this, I believe, quite strongly because of the way that we enacted a governance model that was taught to us by Guru Gobind Singh Ji and Mata Sahib Kaur and Mata Jito Ji, which is a Sarbat Khalsa. And so this idea of decisions being made by the people as a whole, and every voice mattering, and every voice having a say, regardless of how important, quote unquote, or non important a person is. Really dramatic idea of democracy, but in a very different way than democracy was understood in the European context. This consensus based decision making process, this legislative body of the Sarbat Khalsa, allowed for decisions to be made really radically and quickly, but to always be made under the authority of the Guru. So that the decisions that the Sarbat Khalsa came up with were called Gurmatas, from the word Gurmat, from the word Mata, meaning a decision, so that they were considered the Guru's decision. And if you went against a Gurmata, you were literally ostracized from the Khalsa Panth. You were essentially excommunicated from the Khalsa Panth and would have to retake Amrit or Khandiki Pol to rejoin the Khalsa if you went against a Gurmata. And that's how important this decision making system was that the Khalsa came up with at that time. And that really allowed the Khalsa to adapt very quickly to different changing scenarios. In the article, I talk about this idea that um, leadership in that time period was something that was constantly being tested, so that it was a meritocracy, which is very different from maybe later periods of Sikh history, which became more of a succession-based leadership model. So that the decision making was done at the Jatha level, and the Jathas chose the leader based on who was the best warrior, but not only the best warrior, who was the greatest Sikh, who did the most seva, who did kirtan the most beautifully, who practiced the Rit the most strongly, who served the poor the most passionately. Those types of reasons, those types of markers were taken into the decision making of the community as to who should lead them, which is a really beautiful way of choosing the leadership. It was based on this on merit of how much you lived up to the standards of the Guru. And there's some really incredible stories from that time period of what type of people the leaders were of the Khalsa at that time. So you have people like Jassa Singh Ahluwalia, who was trained to do kirtan by Mata Jito and Mata Sahib Kaur, and he was known primarily as a kirtani first before he became a warrior. You have people like I forget his name now, the leader of the Karor Singha missile. I believe his name was he was Ratan Singh Pangu's Nana Ji. I believe his name was Sham Singh. I may be wrong on that. But he was known for serving people langar wherever he went, at every village that he freed from Mughal and Afghan rule. He would serve langar to the people, and he would only eat the leftover langar after having been served to the poorest of the poor in those villages. And that only he would only eat their leftovers, demonstrating that he was their servant, the idea of servant leadership. So really powerful, real putting into practice Sikhi principles in this really beautiful way. So that's what I mean by an argument, that it's not just survival, but they were actually trying to show, like, this is how, if we had a state, this is how we would run it. And that they were still practice their sovereignty. They still had their Nishan Sahibs, they still had their Nagade, those war drums. They still carried Guru Granth Sahib Ji in a royal procession, like all those things that we consider as markers of a state. They still had that, even if they were living in the jungle or in the desert, they still demonstrated that. So they didn't have coins like the earlier period or later periods. They didn't have official hukamname or letters or anything like that, but they were still able to practice Sikhi in this really beautiful way and practice that political theology that I talk about in this really dramatic way, even under the most really horrific of circumstances.
Mm. So then we move into the Khalsa Sultanate, roughly 35 years, right?
Yes.
So there's a movement from survival with an argument to this kind of confederate arrangement, which is perhaps more structured. Could you describe what shifts into the second half of the 18th century? Kind of what are we looking at in the Khalsa Sultanate period?
Yeah, what we're looking at is what outside observers often call a confederacy. And it's called a confederacy because it's not one missile ruling, it's not one group ruling, but it's many groups ruling together. And they would come together at Sarbat Khasas to make collective decisions when needed. Otherwise, they operated on their own. A few things happen that we can be critical of during this time period. And I think it's important to be critical of Sikh history, but at the same time, not being overly critical and also appreciating the constraints that folks were under at the time. But one of the things that does happen is that leadership ends up becoming more nepotistic at this time, that it ends up being something that's passed down from father to son often, or from father to nephew, or from cousin to cousin, if a person doesn't have children, and so on. And so this is really a time period where uh, we have almost the emergence of these mini states happening. The missiles are almost become like mini states in a sense. Um, but they work together also when needed in this really incredible way that really confused outside observers. And you can see um, outside observers, when Europeans came into contact with the Khalsa during this time period, the late 18th century, and they see how the Sabbat Khalsa functions, they just don't understand it. They're so confused by it. They're like, what is happening here? How are they making decisions? How does everyone have a say? How does the smallest missile have just as much of a say as the largest missile? Why are they all treated equally? Like, they were just so confused by the whole system. They didn't understand it at all. It was so foreign to them. But it was something that made complete sense from the Sikh angle because of the decades of learning this behavior of how to govern together as a unit that had been taught to them by Guru Gobind Singh Ji at Anandpur Sahib. So there's also during this time a lot of political pragmatism. I talk about that in the article as well. So that the missiles form alliances, they develop diplomatic strategies, and at times they also compete with each other. And so there is an inter missile conflict happening as well, which is unfortunate, of course, to see Sikhs fighting against Sikhs. But this is a reality of what happened at that time period. And so it's not something that we can shy away from either. We also start ruling over large cities at this time. So the first city, large city that we free during this time is Lahore, which is this ancient capital of Punjab, a really multi-ethnic city with a lot of Muslim and Hindu inhabitants, with a few Sikh inhabitants as well. And the Sikhs were able to rule over Lahore in a way that made Lahore very prosperous because unlike maybe previous governments, no one community was being put above other communities. Everyone was being treated equally. People were being given opportunities that they may not have been given in other situations. And that's really important, this idea of ruling over plural populations is something that happens during this time, which really serves as a um, sort of sneak preview of how Sikhs would run a larger state under Ranjit Singh. Um, and it's really impressive to see how Sikhs ran these urban centers at that time. In fact, places like Amritsar, really interestingly, are ruled by multiple missals. So that's three missals come together and rule Amritsar jointly, continuing that idea of joint authority and governing together through consensus, which is really a beautiful representation of the Khalsa Panth being put into action, of each voice having a say. There were, of course, limits to this model, and I talk about those limits, but essentially you have succession disputes at that time. You also have the fact that it's hard to coordinate foreign affairs. It's hard to coordinate diplomacy. It's hard to coordinate a strong military when you have multiple smaller units that are sometimes in competition with each other. And so naturally, what came out of the missile period, with hindsight, it seems quite natural that this would have happened, is the rise of our fourth period, which is Ranjit Singh's Raj, or what we call the Sarkari Khalsa. And the Sarkari Khalsa is able to do certain things that the missiles were not able to do. It is able to um, have stable borders. It's able to have relations with foreign powers. It's able to have a large organized army, a professional army. It's able to administer the land and people within its territory in a more stable and coherent way than was being done before, in a way that can be done sort of cohesively across Punjab and outside of Punjab as well, in areas that Sikhs ruled over, like Kashmir and so on. So the fourth time period is really this time period where we see administration coming into its own. I talk about briefly in the article about daftars or offices, this idea of really a bureaucracy being formed, which of course we think of in a negative way a lot of times. Bureaucracies is something that we don't appreciate, but of course bureaucracies are also essential for the functioning of a state, and the Sikhs needed to have a functioning state, and so they created a bureaucracy at that time. So there was centralization that happened during Ranjit Singh's time, of course, where sovereignty was being concentrated within one individual or one ruling family. But there are still, even during this time, the purview of Gurmat still exists. Coins are still being made with Ranjit Singh bowing before Guru Nanak Sahib Ji, for example, or coins being issued in the name of the Gurus, for example. That Ranjit Singh is never called Maharaja by fellow Sikhs. He's called Sardarji or Singh Sahib, because of course Maharaj for Sikhs is only Guru, Guru Granth Sahib Ji, or the embodied Gurus of the 10 historical Gurus. And the fact that this is a multi-ethnic, multi-religious state where people's rights are being respected, where even though Sikhs have come out of a century of conflict with Islamic rulers, Muslims are not mistreated during Ajit Singh's Raj. And in fact, some very high officials within his state, like the prime minister, are Muslim citizens. And Muslims have the right to practice their religion openly and freely in a way that Sikhs may not have, or Hindus may not have had during Islamic times of rule. That Ranjit Singh sort of gives or patronizes many different religious institutions, both of Hindus and Sikhs and Muslims, and gives wealth to all these different groups to really beautify and make impressive their buildings and their institutions in a way that matters. Now, from a Gurmat perspective, there's a lot that we can be critical of Ranjit Singh's Raj. the destruction of the Sarbat Khalsa model isn't ideal. The concentration of power in one individual is quite problematic and leads to a weakening of the system quite dramatically after Ranjit Singh's death and allows it to be quite easily taken over by the British. That could be argued as one of the main problems that arose out of that concentration of power. And so it's not um, an ideal time period in terms of Gurmat, but it still is operating under Gurmat principles, and it's also being attuned to the constraints of the time. The time required a Sikh state, and that's how Sikhs understood how a state should operate at that time, and that's what they enacted. And Ranjit Singh was able to successfully govern Punjab so well that that is still considered the golden period of Punjab, even all these centuries later, even a century and a half later, 2 centuries later. It was the height of our art, height of our literature, height of our architecture, height of our musicology. All those artistic forms were really at their height during Ranjit Singh's Raj because that was the longest time of peace that we had as a community, and that was a time where um, artists were able to be supported in a way that they had never been supported before or since, which really has had a dramatic impact on Sikhi to this day. The way our gurdwaras are designed in a very real sense, the literature that the Panth reads was produced during that time period, the music the kirtan traditions that we value were really articulated during that time as well. So this was a really important time period in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, so thank you for that overview. And I think there are lots of questions that are raised for me, and I'm sure for our listeners about kind of how to make sense of these contradictions of the Ranjit Singh period. As you're saying, it is remembered as this golden age in like popular, common sense historical memory, but there are these kind of complexities. But I think what you're drawing attention to in all four of these moments is that how sovereignty is enacted has necessarily to be flexible because times change, material circumstances change, the needs of the moment change, but also, perhaps the needs of the moment are at times not met, and kind of how do we balance that assessment, which leads me to a broader question, which is you suggest in the article, and I agree with you, that the kind of repertoire of Sikh sovereignty that you have just given us an overview of and that you write about um, offers us some kind of lessons or guidance for the present. And I think it's always difficult to assess the period in which we are living and the period that, is our day to day. But I will go ahead and ask the question of kind of how do we make sense of what's needed today to practice to let's say continue enacting Sikh sovereignty, and how do you see these kind of this century and a half post-embodied guru period, pre-colonial period as kind of teaching us something of how we might practice Sikh sovereignty today.
Yeah, what I was trying to really um, articulate in the article is that Gurmat Gurmat was something that every era aspired to in their own way, and each era was imperfect in some ways, and each era was really inspiring and beautiful in other ways. And so there's a lot that we can learn from each of these eras, but what we can't do is try to recreate the past. Because, of course, the material circumstances have changed. The makeup of the Panth has changed dramatically. The size of the Panth has changed dramatically. The where the Panth is located has changed dramatically. Where we have a huge diaspora now. You and I both live in it. We're speaking in English. We're not speaking in Punjabi for this talk. Like the nature of the community has changed quite dramatically during the last century and a half of post-colonial time period. So what I'm trying to say is that we can learn a lot from the past, but we cannot recreate it. So we can't create a state like Baba Banda Singh Bahadur had. We cannot create a state like Maharaja Ranjit Singh had. And we can't even struggle in the same way that the Khalsa of the 18th century struggled, because, of course, they lived in jungles and deserts and had to survive for their day to day, whereas we live in cities around the world. And so the way that the lessons that are to be learned, I think, are many, um, but the question is, are we willing to learn them? Are we willing to look at our history with a critical eye, but an appreciative eye as well? And are we able to understand that as wonderful as these time periods of the past are, each of them were mixed successes in different ways. We can learn from the past, and we need to learn from the past. But what we need to learn, I think, really most importantly, is the fact that the Khalsa needs to be flexible, that certain principles need to be upheld at all times, that certain Gurmat ideals cannot be bent or changed, like protecting the poor or standing up for the rights of others, that certain things are non negotiable. But a lot of how it looks, how it operates, how it functions is open for negotiation and must be open for negotiation, because we're not trying to recreate a medieval state. We're not trying to create an early modern state. We're trying to create something very different today. And so when we talk about Sikh sovereignty today, it needs to be something that is really responsive to the world that we live in and makes sense for the circumstances of the Panth today, makes sense for the 80% of the community that lives in Punjab, for the 13% of the community that lives in outside of Punjab in India, and for the rest of the population that lives in different countries around the world. And so that's really what I think that I hope that we as a community can sort of come to an understanding of is how can we take those principles of Gurmat and enact them in our time in a way that is meaningful, stays true to the gurus and the examples that they set for us, but also is very responsive and radical for our current situation. And so that idea of still being revolutionary, still being radical, still being bold, and thinking about doing things in a very different way than they're done today, but not always in the same way that we've done them in the past, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I think that brings me right to the last thing I wanted to ask you, which you've already kind of started to talk about when you said that we ought to have some kind of appreciation for the past without attempting to, like, go back in time, because that's impossible. I think one of the broader points that I am hearing you make, and I think that you make in the piece, is that there are two kind of pitfalls maybe of how we think about Sikh history, and those pitfalls are kind of this nostalgic desire to return, but also this kind of, I think we can also sometimes fall into the opposite extreme of kind of saying, kind of blaming all of the things that feel like a challenge to the community today on like the failures of those who came before us, right? I think those are kind of the two maybe instinctive ways in which we might think about the past. I mean, certainly you and I think, have talked about this in our experience with Civic that you mentioned before, and kind of how can we, as you say, bring a critical eye to Sikh history, have a sense of kind of needing to evaluate what worked and didn't work, but also not fall into either of these traps. Kind of viewing Sikh history as kind of living in our day-to-day, and not seeing it as something that we can just kind of either yearn for or throw away. I'm just curious if you have any further thoughts on that, anything to bring us to the end of our conversation today.
Yeah, just really quickly, I think you covered most of it. It's just try to stay off social media these days for my mental health. But I still have a window to it because my father, like a lot of our parents, is on social media obsessively and will always forward me stuff from Instagram or TikTok of all things and Facebook and so on. And it's the nature of social media, of course, is that controversy sells. Controversy is what gets people's eyes on stuff, and the sort of understanding of the Sikh past that I see being um, talked about in these spaces, which we all live in now online, is really simplistic often, and it's often either really critical or really laudatory. Like either it was amazing during that time, or everything that uh, was wrong was because of that time period. And so you'll have people like praise Ranjit Singh for being this incredible ruler, or you'll have people like really tear into him because he didn't practice Sikhi quite. Um, he himself didn't live up to that, for example. He drank and he used opium and so on and so forth. And so or he had multiple wives and all those sorts of issues, right? Um, and I think that we need to really have a more nuanced understanding of our own past, of being appreciative of the Khalsa of the past that's struggled and tried their hardest with the constraints of their time, but also being able to be critical, but without being reactionary. And I think being critical is really an important skill that we've lost. Being critical doesn't mean to criticize endlessly. It means to look at it and understand what the shortcomings were and how we can learn from them. And um, the last, since 47, especially the last 80 years of Sikh history have sort of been every like 20 years making the same mistakes again and again in our leadership, especially at the Panth level in Punjab, especially, and in India. And I think that's really a symptom of the fact that we're not learning from the past and we keep repeating the same mistakes again and again because we haven't learned how to be critical of the past in a way that's helpful or productive or healthy. And we aren't learning the lessons that we need to learn from the past so that we can move forward as a community in a healthy way. So that's what I would like people to sort of take away at the end of this is let's have an appreciation of the Khalsa of the past, but also be critical of where they might not have uh, lived up to the standards that we have today, and understand that everything that we do today is going to be criticized by future generations of Sikhs. And
Yeah.
if you're a parent, you can understand this quite well because, of course, everything you do, your children criticize you like crazy, in the same way that we criticized our parents when we were younger, and that's sort of the natural progression of things. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much. I think that's a good place to wrap up our conversation today. And thank you for your time, Santbir. It was great to talk to you about this article. And I encourage all of our listeners to read the article in full at sikri.org/articles. Do you have anything that you want to say in closing, Santbir?
No, I just wanted to thank you for the really thoughtful questions that you had for me today. I really appreciated this conversation. It's always nice to talk about things that we write about and not just be writing in a silo. So I really appreciated this conversation and thank you so much for having me on today.
Thank you, Santbir, for your time, and thanks to all of our listeners for tuning in today. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa,
Kya
Waheguru Ji.
Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh.
Thank you for tuning in to the Sikh Cast. View more Vaisakhi content at sikri.org/Vaisakhi.
You were listening to Sikh Cast by Sikh Research Institute, illuminating every path.